Good evening, Pascal. Merci.
Good evening,
Thank you
yes.
so much for being here with us. I already told that you have more than 20 years experience, not just in China, but also in Silicon Valley. So I would like to ask you, how did China came about in your life?
Well, it's a long, long story, but let's start with when I was a kid, I loved martial arts, so Kung Fu.
There you go.
So this is the emotional part, but in 1988, so that's a long, long time ago, 33 years ago or 35 years, I started studying Chinese. And after a year, I wanted to go to China to figure out, is this really something I would like to continue for the rest of my studies and maybe the rest of my life? And I fell in love with the country. That's in 1990, so that's 33 years ago.
And how did you get there?
Well, the first time I went there is just take a plane to Hong Kong and then travel the border, and that was as a tourist in 1990. For 2 months, I traveled through the country, everywhere I went, just to see and get really, look at this different culture, this different country, and I was super amazed to see how the energy of China was.
Of China.
Yes.
And can you already say that the China then is already different than the China that we have now?
Oh yeah, totally.
Okay. This is going to be one of the conclusions that
yes,
for
totally.
sure we are going to get there. So that some of that experience here also prompt you to write 2 books. Well, at least the ones that we have here. The first one, China's New Normal, where you completely surprised me about the technology advanced China that we have. And we really don't know.
No, I think many people don't know what's really happening in China when it comes to innovation and changing and leading the world in new technologies and even inventions, but very often the implementation of technology into society. I mean, it goes so fast. I mean, they come up with an idea, but then the next day it's already implemented in an application. People can use it. It's often cheap. It's just affordable, but also it's very easy for people to use the application. So people start using it more, and so more people start developing. And I think this book was really about telling the world that I see happening in the next 5 to 10 years, how China wants to lead in terms of innovation, and why maybe they could be able to do it.
Yes, because and then we go to your most recent book, I think, which is "Can We Trust China?" which is with a question mark. But one of the things that I take from this book, and if you like the experience of being here with us and talking to us, maybe this is going to be the book that we are going to talk some other time, is that China entrepreneurs look at the client in a different perspective.
Yeah, for them it's their livelihood. So Chinese entrepreneurs, they understand that without clients, there's no business. And so they constantly look at the market, they constantly look at the customer. If the customer doesn't want their products, basically their company is not going to succeed. And so what they do is they bring the market into their company very often, rather than just selling their products to the market.
But this is when one of the first monolithic visions of China starts to crumble. It's because the idea that we have in China is that they eat whatever it's put on their plate.
No, totally not. No, Chinese are probably one of the most demanding and difficult customers in the world. What we also have as a misunderstanding when it comes to China is we often think, Chinese they will do everything, and they have a lot of patience because they have long-term planning and they have long time. But actually, Chinese are very impatient. They want things now. They don't want it tomorrow because they're not sure they're going to get it tomorrow. So that's cultural also defined.
And it's challenging also for the companies.
Oh, yeah.
And the most extraordinary thing is it is what drives innovation, is the need to please the client.
Yeah, because if you don't please the client leaves you and the client goes somewhere else because there's another company that will provide the service.
But it's here in the West where we hear that client is king.
Yeah, well, in China the client is the emperor. So you have to please them, otherwise you're not going to survive.
That's a good. What prompted you to write this book with such a challenging question? Can we trust China?
Yeah, because it's the question that more and more people have been asking themselves the last 3 years, specifically since the pandemic. It's all been about China. They started distrusting China. The perception of China has become more and more negative. And that's also because China has been closed up for 3 years. And so people didn't have the information. We weren't able to travel there to see it ourselves. Now, luckily, since this week, we can travel again to China.
True.
But that means that we have started to create our own reality of China. And it wasn't a very positive one.
And just because you said this week, I need to say to our viewers that we are recording this in the week after, or it was the week that opened?
Yeah, so it's opening the 8th of January.
January, and we are recording this interview exactly this week. In this new book, one of the things that surprised me is that you have the 8 circles of trust that they have in China. And I was expecting to see the party, the Communist Party, and the government in the first circle, and it's not there.
It's in number 6. It's very low down, or number 5 and 6.
So can you explain us a little bit about this cultural trusting Chinese people?
Well, if you've done business with Chinese, or you've lived amongst Chinese like I have for 20 years, then you learn that everything is a relation-based culture. And it's all to do with, it starts from the family, and this is where Confucianism starts from. And it's all to do with trusting the people that you have lived with most of your life, or at least when you were young. And this is the family culture. And that really creates this bond of network. In Chinese, they call that guanxi. It's a Chinese word. But it really means that, yeah, if I do something for you, you have to somehow do something for me, because this is kind of like the bond that we have. We trust each other blindly almost. And so you have to be inside that circle of trust in order to do business, in order to create friendships.
That type of relationship is even more important than just the product itself?
Then the product, yeah, it's definitely more important because they survive together as a relationship. It's a wolf pack that sees the rest of the world as constantly changing, and they have to survive. So that relationship has to be strong. Otherwise.
So in terms of economical speed, if I may say so, this is very good for the companies, because you can start by creating this relationship, put forward the product that you know you are going to develop into a finer and better product later, right?
Yes, totally. And so you can trust that if the people that work together have good trust, that things will go fast. And you don't need NDAs as much as we need it in the West. So non-disclosures are not as important, because you don't need that if you just can have a handshake and do things.
That's true.
Yeah.
And you think this is one of the lenses that we don't quite get it in the West?
No, and that's because we, as Westerners, when we go to China, we're often outside of that circle of trust. And so that's the downside of a circle of trust of China, is that when you're outside, they don't per se need to trust you, which means that's where distrust starts, and where some people get scammed and there's problems because you're not part of that family.
Yeah. So Pascal, just because we are talking about this Can We Trust China book, there's a couple of chapters that you have the Western lenses compared with the Chinese lenses, and it's interesting because it's also kind of the experience that I have. I'm sorry, but I'm used to, as a Western kid, the bad guys always had eyes like the Chinese, or speak like the Russians, have the accent like the Russians. So, but one of the first contacts that I have with a Chinese and Chinese business were these €1 stores. And that gave me immediately the perception that things in China don't have any quality.
Yep. And it used to be true. If you go back 30 years ago, I mean, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the factories, they had not the talent, so they couldn't build really high quality products. Today, very different story, of course. But it's true, 100%, that perception from back then has stayed on. But today it's completely different world where if you want the best quality, you want the best electrical car or a drone, I mean, they're coming from China these days because they're able to build these high quality products. The only difference is that we still want to pay a lower price because we think it's made in China.
And the view that China has of this situation is different, is that somehow the West wants to keep China inside a straitjacket.
Yeah, they want to keep China as the cheap factory of the world. That's how many Chinese think of it. And the fact that they can develop and build the greatest products that are available is, in many Chinese view, not something the West wants, because we are used to innovate, we are used to build these great products, and so they don't see China as being able to, and if they do, they don't feel it's fair because this is us doing it.
And one of the most extraordinary things is that since you have some experience in Silicon Valley, is that probably there was a time where Chinese copied, and probably there are some products in place that were copied from Western products. But nowadays we see Western companies copying
Chinese. Yeah. No, it's completely starting to reverse. That doesn't mean that there's no more Chinese copying Western products. That still happens.
Well,
but it's less and less, because the Chinese are starting to copy themselves. They're starting to copy other Chinese because the products from China are often better, in many cases specifically consumer products, than products that we can find here.
And you think that, for instance, intellectual property also creates some tension between Chinese and Westerners?
Yeah. Well, for many, and I wrote that in my book as well, for many Chinese, they feel that intellectual property was a way for us to keep China as like, yeah, you cannot have this, and you have to pay a lot of money if you want it. Because for them, if you think from the Chinese culture perspective, I mean, a lot gets shared, and copying, which we see as very negative, is often about sharing. If you think about software, you have open software, open data, then it's all okay. And so Linux is an example of that software, it's all open. And so there we understand that open is okay, but Chinese think the same for hardware, think the same for pharmaceuticals, and so on. So.
But there's something that we need to remind ourselves also when we talk about China. We are talking about a 5,000-year-old civilization.
Yes.
China didn't appear yesterday.
No, it appeared a long time ago.
And do you think this is why Chinese people sometimes feel disrespected by other nations?
Yeah, I think so. Because I do believe that the culture plays an important role. They're very proud to be Chinese, specifically now. Now, the interesting thing is 30 years ago, 20 years ago, they were more looking at us as being some people that they could learn from. So they were seeing themselves as lesser than the Western world. And we were the teachers, and we were telling them what to do, and we were selling our great quality products, and they positioned themselves as lesser to the West. That has changed. And now that they feel we can build the same products as anywhere else, we've built the 5G, we've built the drones, we built electrical vehicles, we built
AI is
everywhere.
Tremendously advanced in China.
So now this culture is coming back. And now they're saying, yeah, well, it's because we've been doing this for 5,000 years. We've not been doing it just yesterday. The only difference is they missed the Industrial Revolution. And because of that, they feel for 100 years that with IP, that the West has actually kept them a little bit in the straitjacket.
Yes, but you know that we all have something in Western civilization, well, all over the world, that was invented in China, you know. So it's kind of a paradox that we don't give credit to such a advanced civilization in its own time. Another thing that there are different lenses is about agreements. Westerns say that Chinese companies and people, they don't keep their word or their agreements.
Yeah, I mean, that's the perception we definitely have. And there's more than enough cases to showcase this, that you say something to a Chinese, I want this, that, and then otherwise they change the contract, they change the conditions. I mean, it's really annoying. And this is a Western lens that we have. We should, of course, ask the question, why is this happening?
Okay.
And
that is the question that you answer then, seeing this from the Chinese perspective, which is?
Well, basically, from the Chinese perspective, it's all about the relationship. And so as long as you trust each other, everything can be agreed at any point. But the thing is that you should also see things in change. And so I think the Chinese really understand that things are changing constantly. And so that means that if you're willing to change, you will always come to an agreement. But it's also that they feel that these some of these agreements are really to keep them to certain conditions, while they actually are maybe already in a different world and
in
a different
degree and a different dynamic. One of the things that that you say here also is that China is obviously the factory of the world.
Yes.
And it looks like Westerns had no problem about the people that work tirelessly in those factories, as long as the product was considered Western. Yes. But as far as Chinese are concerned, well, that has to change.
Yeah. So from a Chinese perspective, the factory of the world is what got them to become more wealthy and more well-off. So they worked really day and night. They didn't do this for us. They did this for themselves and their family to get a better life.
Yes, but many of us also got rich because
we got very rich because of that, and we kept our wealth. And so we were more than happy to send the products to China to have them do the work that we didn't want to do anymore. And what we didn't see happening is that these companies, these factories, were starting to learn from us. They started to innovate. They started to become more efficient than us, have a better supply chain, and then suddenly the roles are starting to change.
You say in the book also that from a Chinese perspective, many of these international agreements were made without China being there.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's mostly on the international side. That if you look at most of the agreements that were made internationally at the United Nations or WTO, I mean, China was a member of WTO in 2001. So this is 20 years ago. Well, GAFA and WTO has existed for much longer. So that means that they were in part to write these basic laws at that point. And maybe at that time it was okay, but the world has changed. But the laws haven't changed and the regulations haven't changed.
And can we say that China made an effort to open up to the world?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're still trying to do that today. Yeah. We don't believe it always, but they're still trying to open up to the world.
Well, they're more open than they were before.
Definitely. If you go back 30 years ago, and that's what we often forget, if you go back 30 or 40 years ago, everything was closed in China. And so every year, China opened up more and more. And that's still going on. Maybe not at the speed that we would want it, but it's definitely, from a Chinese perspective, at a much faster speed than they probably expected themselves.
Don't you think this is one of the paradoxes, even for people that are open-minded regarding China, is that they are able to have full speed ahead regarding innovation, but regarding relationship and trust, they go slowly. Is this because of Confucianism?
Yeah, it's because they want to protect some of the things that were 5,000 years old. Yeah. And at the same time, they want to go to that new future, but you just can't throw away the 5,000-year-old culture. So when it's about that, they are very cautious. But what I always feel after 20 years living in China is that they're very cautious, but when they can jump, they jump. And so this is where
they take risks.
They take risks. And so every year there's one thing that they open up, and that's a risk that they take. And so, yeah, they take decisions quickly, and that changes things quickly. But they wait a long time before they make that decision.
Regarding the what is called the Yellow Peril, this is something that is sometimes almost repeated ad nauseum regarding China. And then we see for instance, Macau went back to China, Hong Kong went back to China. And somehow the narrative in the West is that China wants to create an imperial state.
Yeah. And that's something which is quite strange for most Chinese to understand, because they have never in history invaded or went outside of their country. Now we could debate Hong Kong and Macau and what is that part of China or not, or Taiwan or Xinjiang. That's a different debate, but it's within the borders or the regions within China. But outside their country, they had the best ships in the 18th and 17th century in the world. They went all the way to Africa, but they never ever invaded another country. And so from their perspective, they don't see themselves as wanting to rule the world. It's also a much too hard job. They see how difficult it is to
1.7 billion people or something like
so
that.
They already have 1.4 billion people.
Yeah.
And they see America's trying to do that, how hard it is.
Yes, but when they look at the West, they have, how can I say, they have logical fears of Western societies wanting to build a kind of imperialism, right?
No, I mean, when they look at their history or our history in the West, then it's very clear that we have built imperiums. I mean, the British Empire, the Roman Empire, and even America is somehow an empire in itself.
Portuguese and the Spanish, we divided the world in two.
Yeah, so we did that clearly. And so for the Chinese, they always say, it's not because you did it that we will do that. I mean, shouldn't reflect your history on our history. And I think that's where the misunderstanding lies. But you also feel that they just want to make sure that China itself is sustainable. And to do that, they need relationships, and that means also influence in the rest of the world.
That's why the New Silk Road Initiative or whatever.
But that's more from a protective direction very often than from actually trying to expanding direction. But that's not the view of many Westerners. It's the view of most Chinese.
And can you, is there somehow a non-binary world that we stopped living in? Because we had a perilous equilibrium then with the fall of Russia, of the Soviet Union and everything. And somehow there was a new sheriff in town, United States. But things are not like that. You think China wants to tell us that there's not one voice telling what we should do?
Definitely. But it's not just China saying it.
Yeah, it's true.
It's most of the southern hemisphere.
That's why the BRICS exist now.
Yes, the BRICS, if you look at India, they're starting to say the same thing. I mean, Saudi Arabia is now playing both cards these days. So you're seeing more and more that in the southern hemisphere, where 30 years ago we were considering that as being the poor and developed countries, are now starting to develop, and they have different expectations. And so China, of course, sees this as their opportunity to say, well, we're not alone in this battle to have a more multipolar world instead of a unipolar world. And so this is what they're fighting for, to have more voices instead of the Western voice.
Still talking about a little bit what the idea that the products from China have no quality. Probably people don't really understand that right now the biggest middle class in the world is the Chinese.
It's Chinese, yes. There's probably 600 million people that have the same quality of life as the middle class in Western Europe. So that's a lot of people.
And
that's
very
more than
demanding clients.
Very demanding clients, and they're still growing, meaning every year there's like a few 10 million people coming on top of that. So it's a huge middle class.
And one of the things that you experience yourself is that probably in the beginning, the ones that drive the quality of the service were the foreigners that were in China.
Yes.
Right now, you see companies and services being careful about their own Chinese clients.
Yeah, it's. I mean, everything is localizing, and so the Chinese clients are the most demanding, and so they also need the management in China to become Chinese, because if the management is not Chinese, you're not going to be able to sell and market and communicate to the Chinese. And so everything becomes more localized because it becomes a standard for what consumers of tomorrow will probably want. And in certain industries, you really see, I mean, in cosmetics, for example, you see very clearly that China is starting to lead certain trends because the Chinese customers, and also Korean and Japanese, I mean, Asian customers, are starting to drive the new demands for tomorrow.
And do you think that if Western companies don't really, well, they need to put pressure on their governments in order to create a basis of some consensus and talk about this issue, we will see Western brands losing to the Chinese brands?
I do believe so. But that doesn't mean we have to just give up. We have to fight for it.
I do understand, but I think companies in the West need to understand that Chinese consumers are willing to pay whatever needed to a good quality product or service.
The middle class in China, and specifically the top middle class, is going to pay premium price, exclusivity, also for experiences, not just for products, for services as well. And it doesn't matter if it comes from China, from anywhere in the world, they're going to compare all that. And he who can deliver it will be doing best in that business. So yes, they're starting to become very demanding. And they will come here with these products, and you see that more and more.
Yeah, it's true. You know that right now in Portugal, still the American tourist is the one that spends more per capita. I think that's the right English word, per capita.
Yeah, per capita.
But Chinese are already in second place and gaining on it. One of the things that obviously maybe derives from the culture of China is what we say the lack of transparency. And when we talk about lack of transparency, it's because Westerns are used to receive the data, information, statistics. But when I read this part, one of the things that I remember was a couple of companies, Western companies, that were supposed to be transparent and weren't, like JP Morgan, Volkswagen with the Dieselgate, FTX more recently, even Enron, which is one of the biggest scandals ever. Is it true that Chinese don't like to give the data so that we can understand the dynamics there?
Well, there's two types of Chinese. There's the business people and there's the consumers, and then you also have the government.
Okay.
And so these are different environments. But when it comes to data, the consumers are much more eager to share data with companies, for the simple reason that whenever they shared data in the past, what they got was better services, better applications. Wow. What we got was more advertisement.
It's true.
From the US and very much Google and Facebook. And so we started hating, so we didn't want to share our data. But then, of course, some companies always take advantage of that data that they have, and that's when the government has to intervene. And now there's a data privacy law in China, which is as strict as GDPR in Europe. So that is really very, very strict, meaning that you cannot just use customer data anymore. When it comes to companies, I mean, it's a little bit like a law firm is also very protective in the West of sharing data because they're worried that something will happen. This is the mindset that many Chinese have.
But when we talk about transparency, we also talk that in times of crisis or moments of crisis, we are used to the Western politicians or governments to come in. Everybody speaks.
Yes.
But I think culturally in China, you say that is different. In times of stress?
Yeah, they try to contain somehow because, I mean, not that they want to fake the data per se. It's more fact that they don't want the data to be manipulated. And so that is something. They often see the West as trying to throw out everything that they have, and it's more a popularity contest than actually anything else. And so it's not about who has the best data, it's about who can shout the loudest. And so for many Chinese, they feel that the data has to be correct to actually show. And so if they don't know it yet, they won't share it yet. And then we feel that they're not transparent.
It's interesting because in the eyes of the Asian, a wise man is not the one that is always speaking.
Yes. Yeah.
Is the one that speaks the least, probably.
The one that listens.
Okay. But talking about, for instance, the lens, which is we are used to hear our government telling us certain things in certain moments. Does that happen also in China?
Yeah, the Chinese government communicates a lot. They communicate very different than us, and it's very formal in many cases. But one of the differences, and I think that's one of the layers that we don't see in China, is that there's a lot more consultation happening with the citizens than here. So we will communicate, but what really happens in China very often is that they will have research groups and companies trying to figure out what is living amongst the Chinese citizens to then take that data, and that's when the moment is that they really are looking at data, because that is the moment that data is important. If the consumer or the citizens is unhappy or wants something different, they want to know. And so the government is very keen on getting the right data.
And because also the government communicates, although in a different way, the idea that we have is that whatever the party says is what goes, and nobody can not say anything differently. But you say that there's even people that question the need to put so much money in this silk
Chinese
belt.
are they're very opinionated, and they will tell on social media with friends, they will tell everything they like and don't like, and they do that. The only thing they are not so open up is about the system. You don't attack the system in China, you don't attack the government in Beijing. Besides those two things,
but can you question
you can question, what you definitely can question is how money is getting applied, and how in local cities, not Beijing, not the central government,
I do understand.
but how local cities are implementing certain things.
But it's extraordinary, because we see some demonstrations, people came to the streets, but immediately what we hear in the Western mainstream media is that they are fighting for democracy, but what we know from these people is what they want is to open their businesses.
Yeah, and I mean, there's two stories to what's happened on the protests, and I had a lot of my friends going to these protests just because they were curious to see what was happening, and there was a lot of people there that were actually going there because there was this incident in Xinjiang with people that died from a fire, and so they actually thought, many people, that they had to go there to actually mourn for the dead there. But then there was a number of people that was really very upset with the whole lockdowns and started protesting, and that was very clear. So it's a proof that you can protest in China. Of course, what happens to these people is a different question.
Yes, but even the type of protest that we see is that they protest because they want things solved. It's not because they
want change. Yeah,
they don't want to change the government or the system.
No.
They want that problem solved because they look at their government as the person who are responsible to solve. Is that
very much? But of course, the protest was a very specific situation and very unique. That there were some people that were really wanting a change of government, and that has not happened in 3 decades. So that, from that perspective, there was something boiling. But in general, most of the people on the streets to protest were actually to make sure that the lockdowns would stop.
For instance, when we see the protests regarding the Evergrande situation, people want the problem solved.
Of course,
it's not because
I mean, they're losing money.
And they are losing.
So they maybe paid some money for an apartment that they will never get, so they
and
do
because
protest.
of this, there's a paradox, which is the Chinese as free as the Westerners. Are there two different lenses that we can see this?
Yeah, I think freedom is a very difficult concept. And when you have a discussion with Chinese about freedom, they always refer back to 30, 40 years ago. And then they said, yeah, but look at what we've achieved from where we come. And so ultimately, we are feeling quite free. And of course, there's a reality. You cannot speak out against the government in certain fashion. There is censorship. And so there's still a limitation on that freedom, which we have. And between Hong Kong and China, mainland China, you see that difference very, very clearly. But for most Chinese who've lived in that world for their whole life, they don't feel as much limited as we would be limited in the West.
It's true, but from the Chinese perspective, they also question, but how can you block Trump? How can you say you don't censorship anyone? And then you have the Twitter files now, and you see that this...
Maybe the Chinese are more transparent in the way that they're censoring than we are. I think that's maybe
that is a very keen
yes.
question that we can. But you talk about an experience because of social control and because of the way Chinese government uses technology in order to. And I want to remember people, 1.4 billion people in China. You said that there was a major discussion in Belgium in 1991 because of 6 cameras that they wanted to put.
Oh, yeah. In my town, in Ghent, where I'm from, there was 6 cameras that they wanted to put, and citizens didn't want it, and they said, no, this is an invasion on our privacy, and this is a big event happening in Ghent every year. It's like, 1 million people almost coming to that event over 10 days. But then suddenly, there was a girl that got lost in the crowd. And because of those 6 cameras, they found the girl back. After that, nobody ever questioned that issue anymore, because they felt this was about security that you need to solve. Now, putting that in a Chinese context, every city is like 10 times bigger than the festival that we have in Ghent every year. So that is...
But still, you say that London has more cameras...
Has more cameras than Beijing, yes. Yes.
I don't know what to say. I'm just surprised, you know.
Maybe the Beijing cameras are better, but there's more cameras
because
in London.
They are the control freaks, you know. And another thing that the Chinese question is sometimes the way people are portrayed. In Hong Kong, they are the freedom fighters, but then if they invade, like a few days ago in Brazil, they are terrorists.
Yes, I mean, this is what Chinese will often say, a double standard. So we use different words for the same thing depending on who does it. And indeed, for Hong Kong is one example. But there's many examples like that when we will feel they are victims when it's about us, and when it's about China, it's they're actually the bad guys.
So there's never a way when we look at China without looking at who is the leader of the party.
Xi Jinping, yes.
It has been like this in the recent history of China. But one of the questions that we have is that, for instance, recently the Portuguese Communist Party changed leadership. And when I look at him, I see all the others. So it's like the same person, but with a different face. Is she like Mao?
Not at all, no. So in China, the leader of the Communist Party and also the president of China has actually changed very often. I mean, there's been Mao, then you have Deng Xiaoping, you had Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and so on. So every leader has been very different and had different focus, different expectations. But when you look at Xi and Mao, because they're very much compared to each other, Mao was a rebel. I mean, he was a revolutionary. He was living in chaos. He was living in a country of poverty. This was a fight for survival in his area. And so this is a very different area where Xi actually lives in, which is much more about stability. He's a bureaucrat. He likes bureaucracy. He likes order. He doesn't like the chaos that Mao created, because in revolutions you have to have chaos, otherwise you can't change things. In today's China, China is a proud nation, it's a rich nation, it wants to go to the future. So Xi Jinping he wants stability rather than chaos, and so it's a very different leadership. But we often think because he's been closing China for 3 years now, and he's gotten the 3rd term, that he wants to go back to the old Mao period. And for some part it's true, but for most part it's untrue.
Is there any logic thinking about if she was taking the steps to improve China, then why risk changing leadership so he would be the best one also to continue this? Because one of the things that you said is that the well-being of the citizens is one of the main how can I say, one of the main goals
of China,
of China, and especially of Xi.
Well, I think one of the number one thing that the Chinese government is afraid of, is worried about, is chaos, and that the country would actually fall apart or stop to develop. Because in the logic that China continues to develop, actually the government can stay in control and everything can stay going forward. Okay. And this is, it could only be reversed in Chinese government logic if from the citizens there's actually a revolution or something happening. And this, they have history to prove that every time a government or an emperor in the past changed, it had often to do with a revolution or some people that actually from the bottom up created that change. And so they're very afraid of that. And so now that in Chinese mindset, actually things are going pretty well. I mean, let's forget 2022 with the lockdowns for a minute, because that's a problem.
Let's all forget.
Let's all forget 2022. But besides that, every year the Chinese have become better off, have more opportunity. China's on the map of the world. So they see a lot of positive evolution. And from that context, the same leaders should continue.
But why do Westerns continue to push a narrative that Xi is a dictator?
Well, he is a dictator in the way that he actually has more power than most people in the world. What that means is that he has power over the government, he has power over the Communist Party.
But Pascal, normally dictators don't worry about.
No, but the thing is, Xi is a special dictator. He's a special dictator. He's a dictator in a country that goes better every year. And so this is a country that is growing very fast. Most dictators that we know actually feed from problems, not from solutions. True. And so I think that's where the dictatorship is different, and where Xi is actually not having to use all his power, because as long as ever the engine keeps running. But he is a dictator because literally in the constitution of China it says that China is a democratic dictatorship.
A democratic dictatorship.
What that means is very complicated.
Yeah, it's true, but even the way we represent the party, we call them CCP, and it's not like that. It's
in Chinese
CPC.
called CPC, yeah. It's Chinese Party and the Communist Party of China, and not the Chinese Communist Party. So we use a different acronym in the West, and the Chinese use themselves.
And also, you say and you state here that when Chinese look at our democracies, they say, well, okay, but they don't own the patent also
on democracies, yes. Because for China, what is a democracy? And this is a big debate between China and the world. And of course we believe, and I come from Belgium, so I come from a very democratic country, and we believe that voting and everybody has one vote, and we elect the people that govern, is the only way to actually create a democracy that is fair for everyone. That's what we believe. In China, they see democracy as long as the government makes sure that the people are getting better off every year and there's improvement. We're actually more democratic, the Chinese say, than many of the democratic countries, because people are getting a better life. And that's also part because of the government, not just the government, but partially because of the government.
But that's another thing that is cultural. People need to understand that entrepreneurs can push the government into some politics.
Oh, yeah,
and there's a conversation constantly between them.
Yeah, because I mean, Alibaba and Ant Financial are very good examples. I mean, at one point, Ant Financial could not go public or IPO, and everybody was saying Jack Ma is out, and so there's full control of Beijing, but they need each other. If you look at it now, 3 years later, I mean, Ant Financial is again doing okay, and Alipay is doing okay again, and so they need each other, and so they talk to each other because they know that these platforms have access to hundreds of millions of people, and they can't just give a product. Actually, they can elevate these people out of poverty, they can elevate these people to a better middle class, and so on. So they need each other, and because of that, they talk to each other.
And one of the things that we need to understand also in Chinese market, and we are entering the last 5 minutes of our program because time just flies by, is that it looks like there are some public structures, public investments that are not really profitable. The high-speed train, you see some cities without people, but they are constructed. How can we understand this in the West?
Well, there's two parts of that. There's some things are constructed because there's a hype and a boom, and like Evergrande has been victim of that, and then there's just more. That is similar to the West. But then there's a lot of infrastructure that's been building, like the high-speed trains, like the bridge between China, mainland China and Hong Kong, or a bridge somewhere to a village where there's 5 people living that nobody ever heard about. This is where China feels they need to do this infrastructure to include everyone of the country within the country. And that's where they often go into over expenditures to make sure that everybody can benefit from that infrastructure.
And you gave a very interesting point regarding a 20 million city, 20 million people city working there, the people, they cannot live there also.
No, that's the high-speed trains, for example. If you think about it, the high-speed trains might not be profitable today, But one of the profitability aspects we don't take into account is because of these high-speed trains, is that 20% of the people taking the trains are not living in cities like Shanghai, Beijing. They live outside the cities and commute every day to the cities.
And the government has no problem supporting that expense as long as the people can...
Because then they can have cheaper homes in different places, which they couldn't have if they would have to live in Shanghai or Beijing.
And of course, there's no talking about China without bringing the human rights situation. What do you see? What is your experience?
Well, human rights is one of the most difficult topics when it's about China. And definitely, I've lived in China in 1990, and I can tell you, if you go back 30 years ago, there was a lot more human rights abuse in general over the whole population than there is today. That doesn't excuse, of course, the things that are happening maybe in Xinjiang with Uyghurs in the past, and also in Hong Kong. There are still problems. But the reality is that if you would expand what happened over the last 30 years to the next 30 years, then maybe in 30 years from now, the human rights situation in China would be better than here, just simply because it's been evolving constantly.
Do you think we need to give China time also regarding those situations?
I think we need to look more at the evolution of how human rights is tackled and not always look back at the past of what they've done wrong, because they've done things that are abuses against human rights.
But you see, this is where the problem of secrecy and bad public relations
it's about communication.
China has. Because nobody knew that in 1991 or something like that, there was a terrorist attack perpetrated by Uyghurs.
Yeah, there's been terrorist attacks in Xinjiang since '91, and that has been gone for a long time. And it's only because of 2001, when the World Trade Center in New York was attacked, that at that point China and America and the whole world was against terrorism, and China started really to doubling down.
Okay, Pascal.
Long story.
Yeah, it's true, and it's a long conversation that we need to have some other time also regarding all this that we've been talking about. Finally, can we trust China?
Well, I think we need at least to be open to understand how Chinese trust each other. If we understand how Chinese trust each other and how they trust the world, I think it's going to be easier to trust China.
And do you think that Westerns have made this more difficult?
I think we have. We have made it more difficult because we have seen China more and more the last year as a problem and not as a solution for the world in the future.
And that's going to be a problem for us, because 2030, probably China will be the biggest economy in the world.
It's very likely that that will happen, yes.
And this means that they won't need us, and maybe we are the ones needing China.
Yes, I think we already need China if you look at everything we buy, but I think maybe at that point we will also need them for the things that we are producing here. And that is the problem. We don't want to lose what we have today.
It's true. Pascal Coppens, thank you very much for this 50 minutes. I extend an invitation for a next opportunity that we have. Thank you so much for being here with us.